Was Hitler actually a Nordicist? That's the question we're answering today. And the short answer is yes, but with some important caveats that most people miss. First, let's define the term. A Nordicist is someone who believes the Nordic racial type, tall, long headed, fair skinned, light haired, light eyed Northern Europeans, sits at the top of the racial hierarchy. Not just white or Aryan in a vague sense, but specifically the Nordic subtype as the purest and most creative branch. Hitler clearly held this view. From the early 1920s onward, he and the Nazi movement treated the Nordic type as the highest form of the Aryan race. In his speeches and in Mein Kampf, Hitler described the Aryan as the only true culture-creating race in history, the Prometheus of mankind. Ancient high civilizations, according to this worldview, were founded by northern migrants who carried that Nordic blood. When those people mixed with other populations, the culture eventually declined. Nazi racial theorists like Hans Gunther ranked the European subtypes in a clear hierarchy. Nordic at the top, then Mediterranean, Dinaric, Alpine, and East Baltic near the bottom. Official materials given to the Hitler Youth repeated this ranking. Hitler himself once stated that the principal ingredient of the German people was Nordic, around 55%, even while acknowledging that Germans were mixed. So yes, the ideology was Nordicist at its core. But here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting. Hitler was not a rigid physical determinist in the way some of the race scientists were. He understood that most Germans did not look like the propaganda ideal. Plenty of southern Germans had darker hair, rounder heads, and shorter stature, more Alpine or Dinaric traits. Strict physical Nordicism risked alienating large parts of the population, including some of his own supporters. So by the late 1930s, the public messaging shifted. Hitler began talking more about the spiritual and national qualities of the German people as a whole rather than pure physical appearance. The emphasis moved from "Are you blonde and blue-eyed" to "Are you part of the German racial community?" In private, however, the Nordic hierarchy never really went away. In 1942, Hitler said he would have no peace of mind until he had planted Nordic blood wherever the population needed regeneration. He believed the varied traits of the German people only reached their full value because of that Nordic racial nucleus. This is why the SS was selected with Nordic physical standards in mind. This is why the Lebensborn program existed, to increase the number of children with those valued traits. This is why in occupied territories, children who looked Nordic were sometimes taken from their families and raised as Germans. The practical policy remained Nordicist even when the public rhetoric softened. There's another important distinction. Hitler's racism was never just about looks. It was about historical struggle. He saw history as a constant racial conflict. The Aryan, especially in its Nordic form, created and built. The Jew, in his view, destroyed and undermined. That opposition was more central to his thinking than exact skull measurements or hair color charts. He could also be pragmatic. He praised Mussolini as a representative of the Alpine race when it suited the alliance with Italy. He ranked most Slavs far below Germans, even though some Eastern populations had Nordic admixture. Racial theory was always subordinated to political and strategic goals. So where does that leave us? Hitler was a Nordicist. He placed the Nordic type at the peak of the racial hierarchy. He saw Nordic blood as the creative and regenerative core of the Aryan race. Nazi policies on eugenics, the SS, and population programs reflected that belief. At the same time, he was a German nationalist first. He accepted that the German people were mixed. He dialed back pure physical Nordicism when it became politically inconvenient, and he cared more about the larger racial struggle, especially against the Jews, than about enforcing a strict blonde and blue-eyed standard on every German. The ideal in the posters and films was Nordic. The reality of the regime was more flexible, more political, and ultimately more focused on power and exclusion than on perfect physical conformity. That's the accurate picture, not the cartoon version, and not the sanitized one either. If you found this useful, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps more than you know. Thanks for watching. Word